Hello, my name is Alex. I am a speech and language therapist, and I'm going to be speaking to you about the possible communication and swallowing difficulties that can be caused by stroke. I want you to remember that a person who's had a stroke can suffer from one or any combination of the communication difficulties that I'm going to be speaking about. The first communication difficulty that I'll talk about is called aphasia. Aphasia is a language impairment. Now, we use language every day to share information with others through speech and through writing. And it is the language areas of our brains that help us to interpret the writing and the speech of others. Aphasia is caused by injury to the language centers of the brain, which in most people are housed in the left hemisphere. Aphasia is therefore a complex problem, and it doesn't just mean that the person cannot speak. There are different degrees and severities of aphasia. A person with severe aphasia could feel like they are in a foreign country because they might struggle so much to understand the speech of others and to make sense of what they are reading. They also might struggle to find the words that they want to say and have very limited speech and limited writing. On the other end of the spectrum are people with milder forms of aphasia, and they might just struggle to find the words that they want to say or to formulate lengthy sentences. They might show good comprehension of what they hear and what they read, but struggle to interpret very complex language. Regardless of the severity of aphasia, it's important to know that most people with aphasia know what they want to say. They are also generally very aware of their surroundings, and they can pick up well on your tone of voice, your facial expressions, and your body language. And they do well if they have a communication partner who is trained to exchange information with them using methods that don't only rely on language. The next set of communication difficulties that I would like to discuss are those that affect speech production. A stroke can cause weakness of the structures involved with speaking, and a stroke can cause injury to areas of the brain that are involved with the planning and coordinating of the movements of the structures involved with speech. When someone has a speech production difficulty, the clarity or the intelligibility of their speech might be affected for various reasons. For example, they might struggle to coordinate breathing with voicing. There might be changes to voice quality. Because of weakness of the tongue or the lips, there could be distorted speech sound production. Speech production difficulties can also affect the rate of your speech, the fluency of your speech, and your use of pitch and loudness variation, which are so important in conveying emotion. Cognitive difficulties associated with stroke are addressed in a different video, but because effective communication is reliant on good cognition, people who have cognitive difficulties following stroke might speak clearly and might read and write well, but because of memory difficulties, difficulties with concentration, difficulties with mental flexibility and prioritizing, they might struggle to prioritize the information to include in an interaction to get to the point of what they want to say. They might struggle to flexibly shift from one topic of conversation to another. They might struggle to concentrate for the duration of a conversation. They might struggle to appreciate and use humor. And they might struggle to use language for very important work-related tasks like debating, negotiating, marketing, arguing, and it's often these cognitive communication difficulties that really impact on social interaction. And it can be distressing because you might think your loved one has changed in some ways. But as will be discussed in the video on cognition, just knowing why these difficulties are there can help one to navigate this journey. The role of the speech language therapist is to assess the communication difficulties of the person who has had a stroke, to identify the nature of the difficulty, and then to formulate a treatment plan that is specific to their communication needs. Our approaches to therapy are both stimulatory and compensatory. We stimulate return of function as much as we can with therapy activities and exercises, and we help the person to compensate for their difficulties using strategies for example, reducing speech rate, or bringing in tools and devices such as alphabet boards, communication boards, picture boards, and even more high-tech communication devices such as speech-generated devices. A very big part of our job is to train the communication partners of the person who has had a stroke on how best to communicate with them. And because communication is so essential to connection with others, social interaction, we try to facilitate reintegration of the person with communication difficulties back into their home lives, back into their social settings, and where possible, back into the workplace. I'd now like to draw our attention to the swallowing difficulties that might be caused by stroke. The structures involved with speaking are the same structures that are involved with swallowing, and so weakness or poor coordination and timing of these movements involved with speech can also translate to swallowing difficulties. If someone has a swallowing difficulty, they are at risk for food or liquids falling into the airway, and if this material reaches the lungs, it can cause a type of chest infection, which we call aspiration pneumonia. A person who is not able to swallow safely might also not take in enough food or liquids. So you can imagine if someone has had a stroke and they have pneumonia and or inadequate nourishment, these two things could really set them back in their journey to recovery. And so we want to avoid this. And this is why a speech therapist is called upon to assess the swallowing of a person who has had a stroke as soon as possible. We start off with a bedside assessment. Here we will give the person who has had a stroke different food textures to swallow, and we look for signs of swallowing difficulty. Ideally, we will take the person for what we call a modified barium swallow examination, which is a type of video X-ray. And there we can see clearly if food is manipulated in the mouth safely and swallowed safely to the stomach, or if anything enters the airway. Based on our assessment findings, we will make recommendations. In many cases, we allow the person to eat. In some cases, we need to make diet modifications. For example, some stroke survivors swallow thicker liquids more safely than thin liquids. In other cases, where there are weakness of the oral structures, we might introduce pureed or soft solids as opposed to tough, crumbly consistencies. In cases where we are concerned about risks of aspiration pneumonia or inadequate nourishment through oral feeding, we might, in discussion with the doctor, recommend a feeding tube. Although a feeding tube can be a scary thing to think about, it's actually a wonderful tool, especially in the beginning, to make sure that the person who has had a stroke is fed and that their lungs are kept safe. We monitor the swallowing closely and we stimulate the swallowing mechanism, and I can assure you that in most cases, stroke survivors do go back to safe eating. I hope that this video on the communication and swallowing difficulties that might arise after a stroke has been helpful. We know that every stroke has a different presentation and that everyone's journey to recovery is different, but we want to assure you that there is help and support every step of the way. Thank you.